So as a quick rundown, shutter speed, how fast the shutter closes and opens, A bigger shutter speed means the longer it stays open. The shorter the shutter speed, the faster it closes. Aperture, how small or big the f-stop is. So if it's a 1.8 aperture, it's going to let in more light, and if it's a 22 aperture, it's going to let in less light. And the ISO, how sensitive the actual sensor in the camera is to light. Hey guys, welcome back to another video on the channel. Today we're going over the basics of the camera for photography and videography. Now there's a little thing at the end of the video that you need to understand if you're going to do videography or just shoot video in general. So the camera, complex thing. You might be thinking it's a complex thing, but it's really not. So there's three main elements when understanding the camera and shifting from automatic to manual, and those three things are the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. So you're probably wondering, Jack, you're a funny guy, but there's an automatic for a reason. Yeah, there's an automatic for a reason, and you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to get professional gigs. You're not going to... all this is going to be is a hobby if you stay on automatic. You're not going to have full control over the camera. But if you go to manual, you have full control over the three elements. Think of it as like a triangle. Top and bottom, they all work together and they all affect each other. So what the hell is an ISO? The ISO is how sensitive the actual sensor within the camera is to light. So the higher the ISO, the more sensitive the sensor is going to be to light. So if you're in a dark situation, maybe it's dimly lit, you want a higher ISO. But the thing with ISO is, the higher you go, you're going to have this thing called noise. Now what noise is these little nasty, I hate noise with a passion. It's these little particles on the top and bottom, and probably if it's really bad, the entirety of your photo or video, and then it's unusable. You can't really do anything in post to get rid of it. And noise comes about when your ISO is too high. So a good rule of thumb for video is never go above 800 ISO, otherwise you're starting to get those little particles, those little white grey noises in your little grain in your video, and it's going to look hideous, it's going to look ugly, and no one's going to watch your video. But the lower you go, the more less sensitive it is, and that's where lighting comes in. Like I've got here, I've got my ISO at 400, and that's a good ISO. It's not too dark, not too light, and I've got lights coming in. It's perfect. So a good rule of thumb for video is don't go above 800 ISO. Otherwise you're going to start to get noise. The higher you go, the more noise you're going to get. If you're doing photography, however, you could probably try push it to 1600, and I wouldn't go any higher above that. If you need to go higher than that, I would go get an external flash, or the flash on your camera is pretty decent, or change one of the other settings that we're going to go over in just a second to compensate for that. So the second one, aperture. Now what the fucking hell is aperture? Aperture is the f-stop. You might have heard f-stop before. It's the little hole of how much light's let in. So you've got, probably depending on the lens, the common range between aperture is probably 1.8 to probably, probably 22 on some cameras. So the lower the aperture, the more light that's going to be let in. So if you're doing 1.8, you're going to have a shallow depth of field because it's letting more light in, but it's going to be very, very difficult to keep your subject in focus because it's such a small range of aperture. However, to compensate for that, if your subject's moving and you want, say this is a video and your subject's moving and you want to keep your subject in focus and they're not coming into your focus range, have your aperture around about maybe 5 to probably about 7 or 8 depending on what action it is. So the aperture, or the f-stop, how much light the actual little hole lets into the camera, how much light the camera lets in. The lower the aperture, the more light that lets in. The higher the aperture, the less light that lets in. And you can probably see a common theme how these affect each other. So if you have an ISO at about 100 but the subject's too dark, you could increase the aperture to probably about maybe 3, maybe 2, maybe a 1.8, and that would let in the light that it needs to fully expose the image. And the last but not least, shutter speed. Now shutter speed is how fast the camera goes like that, the shutter. If you've got a shutter speed of probably about maybe 1/10 or maybe 2 seconds, the shutter is going to be open for longer and then close. So what that means is it's obviously letting in more light. So if you're doing night photography and you're taking a picture of a building or something, the higher your shutter speed, the more stationary you need to be. So if you're doing like a photography shoot like I was doing here, you need to have your camera on a tripod so it doesn't move, because when it's open, the shutter speed's open. If you move during that time, it's going to record everything that happens and you're going to have this nasty blur and your image is going to look horrible. However, the general rule of thumb for shutter speed is probably to have it 1/60th, 1/80th of a second. That's a good range of keeping your shutter speed in check. The higher you go, the less light that's let in. The higher you go, maybe 1 second, 2 seconds, the more light that's going to let in. Obviously you can see how that affects the other two previous settings, but the lower you go, like 1/4,000th of 1 second, barely any light's going to let in, because it's going to, and you're going to have to increase or decrease certain different elements on your camera to compensate for that. Now the little secret that I was banging on about at the start of the video is when you're doing video on these, your shutter speed wants to be double the frame rate. So if your shutter speed, if your frame rate's about 30, you want your shutter speed to be 60. It can go just a little bit above. If you go lower or up, it's going to look weird, it's going to distort your image, it's not going to look good. So make sure every time you're filming, I think I'm recording about 24 frames per second on that, so my shutter speed is going to be 60 because that's the settings that my camera has. So yeah, every time you're going to do video, make sure your shutter speed is double your frame rate. I'll put a table on here. So if your frame rate's at 60, you want your shutter speed to about 120, probably, yeah, 120, double your frame rate. So guys, that was just a quick little video over the basics of the camera. And I hope you get some value out of this and you can make that transition from automatic to manual, or just get a better understanding of the 3 different types of settings that are in the DSLR. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe to the channel, and if you want me to cover any certain specific parts of the camera, videography, video editing, just let me down in the comments below. And while you're at it, if you want to understand these cameras and get paid for it, I made a video there. Different ways you can get clients during 2021. Don't forget to follow my Instagram and TikTok and all of that jazzy stuff. Links in the description below. And I've also made another video for you, what it's like getting your first client's fee, how do you have to payment, how do you get paid. So that's another video that you might want to check out. Anyways, thanks for checking out the channel and I'll see you on the next video.